frame by frame, film by film. That's how a new reality was created. This phrase by Sergei Eisenstein accurately conveys the essence of Soviet cinema, which became not just an art form, but a true ideological weapon of the state. In a country where the majority of the population was illiterate, moving pictures transformed into a powerful tool for influencing mass consciousness. It was no accident that Lenin called cinema the most important of all arts. He was the first to recognize its revolutionary potential. The screen became a window into the ideal world of building communism, and at the same time, a lens through which the people were supposed to see the enemies of the revolution. Film projectors worked like ideological machine guns, firing off images of Stakhanovite heroes, fearless Red Army soldiers, and insidious saboteurs. Cinema screenings turned into collective rituals where viewers not only watched a film, but underwent a kind of ideological initiation. Thus, cinematography became not only a mirror of Soviet reality, but also its active creator, shaping in the minds of millions a new worldview where good and evil had clear class outlines. The first frames of Soviet cinema were born in the flames of revolution and civil war. In 1918, when the young Republic of Soviets was fighting for survival, agitation trains, veritable mobile cultural centers, crisscrossed the country. Inside these trains were film projectors showing revolutionary newsreels in the most remote corners of the country. It was then that Vladimir Lenin uttered his famous phrase about cinema as the most important of all arts. He saw in it a powerful tool for transforming the consciousness of the masses. Dziga Vertov played a special role in the establishment of Soviet documentary cinema. His newsreel, Kino Nedelya, Cinema Week, and later Kino Pravda, Cinema Truth, became the country's first regular cinematic periodical. Vertov created a new language of documentary filmmaking based on montage, unexpected angles, and the rhythmic organization of material. His manifesto, quote, "to proclaimed the superiority of documentary filming over staged productions," and called the camera a more perfect instrument for understanding the world than the human eye. But the real revolution in cinematography was accomplished by fiction film directors. Sergei Eisenstein, in 1925, created, quote, 3, a film that shook world cinema. The story of the sailors' uprising on a Black Sea Fleet ship transformed into a powerful metaphor for revolutionary struggle. The famous scene of the massacre on the Odessa steppes became a symbol of Tsarist tyranny and cruelty. Eisenstein developed the theory of montage of attractions, where the collision of frames created new meaning, impacting the viewer emotionally and ideologically. Following Battleship, other masterpieces of revolutionary cinema appeared. Vsevolod Pudovkin adapted Gorky's, quote, 6 turning Nilovna's story into an epic about the awakening of class consciousness. Alexander Dovzhenko created the poetic film Earth, where collectivization is shown as a cosmic process of life renewal. These films did not merely reflect revolutionary events, they shaped their mythology, creating a pantheon of heroes and a gallery of enemies. A crucial achievement of early Soviet cinema was the image of the class enemy. In films of the 20s, bourgeois, white guards, and kulaks were depicted as caricature figures, corpulent, greedy, cruel. Their appearance, manners, and gestures were intended to evoke an instinctive rejection from the viewer. In contrast, the revolutionary masses were shown as a unified organism, full of energy and striving towards the future. Soviet cinema of the 20s was experimental not only in content, but also in form. Directors sought new, expressive means capable of conveying the spirit of the revolutionary era. Montage, angle, rhythm, light contrasts, all became tools of ideological influence. The color red in black and white cinema was conveyed through a special expressiveness of the frame, through the dynamics of movement. The 30s marked a turning point in the history of Soviet cinema, the era of the Great Break. Industrialization and collectivization demanded a new cinematic language and new heroes. The experimental avant-garde cinema of the 20s gave way to a narrative more understandable to the mass audience. The revolutionary elemental force was replaced by images of conscious builders of socialism. The film Chapayev by the Vasilyev brothers, released in 1934, became a true phenomenon of Soviet culture. The legendary division commander, fearless and charismatic, embodied the image of a folk hero who intuitively embraced Bolshevism. Boris Babochkin created such a vivid character that Chapayev's phrases entered popular speech, and the scene of his death in the Ural River brought millions of viewers to tears. At the same time, the film masterfully shaped the idea of the necessity of party leadership over spontaneous popular energy. Commissar Furmanov guided Chapayev, just as the party guided the country. Alongside Civil War heroes, the screen was filled with images of heroes of labor. Ivan Pyryev's film Tractor Drivers transformed collective farm life into a musical comedy, where hard rural labor appeared joyful and inspiring. The song Three Tankmen from this film became the unofficial anthem of mechanized troops. Marina Ladinina and Nikolai Kryuchkov created images of ideal Soviet people, beautiful, cheerful, devoted to the cause of building socialism. The theme of vigilance and exposing enemies occupied a special place in the cinema of the 30s. Friedrich Ermler's film The Great Citizen reflected the atmosphere of the Great Terror. The main character, whose prototype was Sergei Kirov, fights against disguised enemies of the party. The film justified mass repressions, forming the image of a hidden enemy who could lurk anywhere, even among old Bolsheviks. The cinema of this period created a strict system of coordinates, where positive heroes embodied the ideal qualities of a Soviet person: industriousness, collectivism, devotion to the party. Negative characters, on the contrary, personified individualism, secretiveness, connection with the past or abroad. The transformation of human consciousness became a crucial theme. The film Counterplan showed how workers took on increased obligations and over-fulfilled the industrial plan. A member of the government told the story of a simple peasant woman who became a stateswoman. These films instilled in viewers the idea of boundless possibilities that Soviet power opened up for them. By the end of the 30s, the military theme became increasingly prominent in cinema. If war comes tomorrow prepared the population for the impending conflict, forming an image of the future enemy and confidence in a swift victory. Cinema became a tool for the military mobilization of society, fostering readiness for self-sacrifice for the homeland. On June 22, 1941, Soviet cinema, like the entire country, awoke to a new reality. The Great Patriotic War demanded an immediate restructuring of the entire film industry. Just 1 month after the war began, the first combat film anthology was released, an anthology of short films designed to boost the morale of the people. These film anthologies were created in record time, sometimes in a matter of days, which was unprecedented for pre-war film production. The image of the enemy in the first war films underwent significant changes. If in pre-war films, Germans were often depicted as potential allies of the working class, now they appeared as ruthless invaders. The short film Feast in Yermunka portrayed fascists as degenerate beings, devoid of human traits. However, As the war progressed, primitive caricature was replaced by a more complex depiction of the enemy. The enemy remained cruel, but became real, which made victory over them even more significant. Wartime cinema branched into two directions. The first comprised heroic patriotic films, such as Ivan Pyryev's Quote, II, which showed the struggle of partisans against the occupiers. The second consisted of more intimate psychological films that revealed the human dimension of the war. A vivid example is Leonid Lukov's Two Soldiers, where Mark Burns performed the famous Dark Night, which became an unofficial anthem for frontline soldiers longing for home. A special place in wartime cinema was occupied by Mark Donskoy's film, Quote, V. The film, shot in 1943, depicted the atrocities of the occupiers in a Ukrainian village through the story of the pregnant partisan Olena Kostyuk. The scene of Olena's interrogation became one of the most poignant in the history of Soviet cinema. The Rainbow was the first film to openly show the tragedy of the civilian population in occupied territories, without softening the horrors of war. The film had enormous international resonance. It was shown in the USA and Great Britain, shaping the image of the USSR as a martyred country resisting Nazism. Wartime cinema created a whole gallery of new heroes. Pre-war shock workers were replaced by images of ordinary people displaying extraordinary courage. The film, She Defends Her Homeland, told the story of a peasant woman who became a partisan detachment commander after the death of her son. Invasion, based on Leonid Leonov's play, showed how war reconciles former enemies in the face of common misfortune, and returning from a camp becomes a hero of the resistance. By the end of the war, large-scale cinematic epics emerged, reflecting the growing confidence in victory. Friedrich Ermler's The Great Turning Point, dedicated to the Battle of Stalingrad, presented the war not as a tragedy, but as a great historical achievement. The film Zoya told the story of Zoya Kozmodemyanskaya, who became a symbol of unyielding resistance and readiness for self-sacrifice. The cinema of the Great Patriotic War became not just a chronicle of events, but a powerful means of national consolidation. It transformed the abstract concept of defending the motherland into a personal, emotionally charged task for every viewer. Wartime films remain unsurpassed in their emotional impact, showing how art can become a real weapon in the struggle for the survival of a nation. When the Iron Curtain fell, dividing the world into two ideological camps, Soviet cinema received a new mission: to create the image of a new enemy. The defeated Nazis were replaced by American imperialism and its European allies. The Cold War unfolded not only in the political arena, but also on cinema screens, where the perception of a treacherous Western adversary was formed. A landmark film of this period was Grigory Alexandrov's, released in 1949. The film depicted the historical moment of the convergence of Soviet and American troops on the Elbe River, but with a clear ideological subtext. Ordinary American soldiers are shown as friendly, but their command is cynical and corrupt. Particularly expressive is the character of General McDermott, who secretly transports Nazi scientists and industrialists to America, laying the groundwork for future confrontation. The film clearly drew a line. Ordinary Americans are potential friends. Their elite are enemies of peace. Mikhail Rom's The Russian Question, filmed 2 years earlier, explored the mechanisms of the West's information war against the USSR. The main character is an American journalist named Smith, who, after a trip to the Soviet Union, writes a truthful book about the country. For this, he is subjected to harassment, loses his job, and his fiancée leaves him for another. The image of the Western press is presented as a tool of manipulation, controlled by capitalists and the military. The film instilled in the Soviet viewer the idea, in the West, the truth about the USSR is hidden, and those who try to convey it are mercilessly destroyed. A special place in Cold War cinema was occupied by Mikhail Kalatozov's film Conspiracy of the Doomed. The film depicted a fictional Eastern European country where American agents and local reactionaries try to carry out a coup d'état to prevent the building of socialism. The film created an image of a total conspiracy. Western diplomats, Catholic priests, former aristocrats. All of them are presented as participants in a single anti-communist network. It is noteworthy that the film was released in 1950, when political trials of enemies of the people were indeed taking place in Eastern European countries. Spy dramas became a separate genre of post-war cinema. Secret Mission, Far from the Homeland, Shadow at the Pier, these films formed the image of omnipresent Western intelligence services, continuously sending agents into the USSR. They cultivated vigilance in viewers, suspicion towards foreigners, and everything Western. The typical plot of such a film: a Soviet counterintelligence officer exposes a spy network, often with the help of ordinary citizens who showed vigilance. Satirical comedies also became a weapon of ideological war. Russian Souvenir ridiculed Western journalists who wrote fabrications about the Soviet Union. Dangerous Tours depicted foreign diplomats as accomplices of terrorists. Laughter became a powerful means of discrediting the enemy. Cold War cinema created a stable gallery of negative Western archetypes: the corrupt journalist, the cynical diplomat, the fanatical military man, the hypocritical priest. These images were so expressive that they formed in several generations of Soviet people a stable idea of the Western world as a realm of lies, corruption, and aggression. The ideological films of this period performed an important function. They justified the existence of the Iron Curtain, presenting it not as a tool for isolating Soviet citizens, but as protection against hostile penetration. Cinema convinced viewers that informational and cultural isolation was not a restriction of freedom, but a necessary security measure. Khrushchev's thaw brought a new breath to Soviet cinema. After Stalin's death and Khrushchev's famous report at the 20th Party Congress in 1956, ideological shackles loosened, allowing directors to explore previously forbidden themes. Military patriotic cinema of this period moved away from the ceremonial depiction of war, turning instead to the fate of the individual against the backdrop of historical upheavals. A turning point was Mikhail Kalatozov's film The Cranes Are Flying, which received the Golden Palm at the Cannes Film Festival in 1957, the first for Soviet cinema. The story of Veronica, who lost her beloved in the war and went through betrayal, loneliness, and moral revival, showed war from an unexpected side, through the prism of a woman's fate. Cinematographer Sergei Urusevsky created a revolutionary visual language. Subjective camera work, expressive angles, and contrasting light transformed the heroine's inner experiences into visible images. Following The Cranes, a whole constellation of films emerged, exploring the human dimension of war. Grigory Chukrai's Quote 3 told the story of young soldier Alyosha Skvortsov, who received a short leave home. His journey transforms into a poignant picture of wartime Russia, and Alyosha himself becomes a symbol of purity and self-sacrifice. The film's ending, the news of the hero's death, was perceived as a requiem for the entire war generation. A special place in the military cinematography of the thaw was occupied by Stanislav Rostotsky's film The Dawns Here Are Quiet, based on Boris Vasilyev's novella. The story of 5 female anti-aircraft gunners and their commander confronting German saboteurs in the Karelian forests became a poignant statement about the incompatibility of feminine nature and war. Each of the heroines is shown through flashbacks to her pre-war life, making their deaths especially tragic. A crucial phenomenon was Alexander Stolper's screen adaptation of Konstantin Simonov's novel. The film honestly depicted the tragedy of the first months of the war: retreat, encirclements, and the confusion of command. The protagonist, war correspondent Sintsov, witnesses and participates in these events. Through his eyes, the viewer saw the unvarnished truth about the initial period of the war, which was impossible in the Stalin era. In the 60s, a new type of war film emerged: the psychological drama, exploring man's moral choices in war. Andrei Tarkovsky's, Alexander Alov, and Vladimir Naumov's Peace to Him Who Enters, and Alexei German's, shelved until the 80s, showed war as an existential test that reveals the true essence of man. Historical revolutionary cinema of this period also underwent significant changes. Monumental figures of leaders were replaced by images of ordinary participants in revolutionary events. Yuli Reisman's Communist told the story of a simple worker, Vasily Gubanov, who came to a village to build a power station during the Civil War. His enthusiasm, selflessness, and faith in a bright future are shown without false pathos, with deep psychological insight. These films shaped in new generations of Soviet citizens a special type of patriotism, not official, not ceremonial, but deeply personal, based on empathy for the fates of specific individuals. They taught pride not in abstract victories, but in human dignity in the most difficult trials. Soviet cinema always strived to show that the ideals of socialism and the struggle for justice were not limited by the borders of the USSR. Films about international solidarity and revolutionary movements in other countries became an important tool in shaping the worldview of the Soviet person as a citizen of the world, fighting against imperialism and colonialism wherever oppression existed. A true breakthrough in this direction was Mikhail Kalatozov's film, quote, shot in 1964. Created in cooperation with Cuban filmmakers, it told the story of the revolution on the island of Freedom through 4 novellas, depicting different aspects of pre-revolutionary Cuba: the exploitation of peasants, the poverty of urban slums, student resistance, and the partisan movement. Cinematographer Sergei Urusevsky created a unique visual language. Long, technically incredible shots filmed with a handheld camera immersed the viewer deep into the revolutionary events. The film began as a poetic address, quote, 1. Another significant work was Mikhail Kalik's film Hostile Whirlwinds, which narrated the story of Felix Dzerzhinsky and his revolutionary activities in Poland and Russia. The picture showed how a young Polish nobleman becomes a professional revolutionary, renouncing the privileges of his class for the sake of fighting for universal justice. Particularly powerful was the scene where Dzerzhinsky, in prison, declares a hunger strike against the arbitrary actions of the prison administration. This film created the image of an internationalist revolutionary, for whom national borders do not exist, only the boundary between oppressors and the oppressed. The Latin American theme continued in Iosif Keifitz's film, quote, 3, which told the story of a simple Mexican girl who, under the influence of communists, realizes the need to fight against American companies exploiting her country's natural resources. The film created a vivid image of Latin American imperialism in the form of soulless corporations supported by corrupt local authorities. The ordinary people opposing them are shown as bearers of natural justice, who intuitively arrive at the ideas of socialism. Films about the struggle against fascism in Europe occupied a special place in international cinema. Vladimir Basov's quote, 5, told of a Soviet intelligence officer embedded in German special services. The action took place not only in Germany, but also in occupied Poland, where the protagonist interacted with the local resistance. The film emphasized the commonality of the struggle of all peoples against Nazism, creating the image of an international anti-fascist front. Igor Gostev's European Story explored the post-war struggle of progressive forces in Western Europe against the resurgence of militarism. A Soviet journalist, a German pacifist, and a French activist united to expose a conspiracy of industrialists seeking to unleash a new war. The film asserted the idea that ordinary people of different countries have common interests, opposing the interests of transnational corporations and the military-industrial complex. The struggle of colonial peoples for independence also became an important theme. Maximka told the story of an African boy rescued by Russian sailors from a slave ship. Black Mountain narrated the struggle of the Indian people against British colonizers. These films fostered in the Soviet viewer a sense of the moral righteousness of the anti-colonial struggle and the perception of the USSR as a natural ally of all oppressed peoples. International motifs also resonated in films about the Spanish Civil War. Grenada, Grenada, My Grenada, through the story of a Soviet volunteer, showed the struggle of the Spanish people against fascism as part of a worldwide struggle for justice. The songs from the film, especially Grenada, to the lyrics of Mikhail Svetlov, became a symbol of international romanticism. All these films fostered in the Soviet viewer a special type of consciousness, internationalist, based on the idea of the unity of all progressive forces of the world in the fight against imperialism, colonialism, and fascism. They created an image of a world divided not along national lines, but along class lines, where the working people of all countries are naturally allies in the struggle for a common just future. The 1970s became an era of large-scale cinematic epics, reflecting a new stage in the development of Soviet ideology. The Brezhnev era of developed socialism demanded monumental works capable not only of capturing the heroic past, but also of strengthening faith in the socialist path among a new generation of Soviet citizens. Chamber military dramas were replaced by multi-series cinematic epics with multi-million ruble budgets, mass scenes, and star-studded casts. A landmark project of this period was Yuri Ozarov's 5-part cinematic epic, created between 1969 and 1972. This grandiose film project covered key battles of the Great Patriotic War, from the Battle of Kursk to the storming of Berlin. The film became a true encyclopedia of the war, where historical figures, Zhukov, Konev, Rokossovsky, Hitler, Goebbels, acted alongside fictional characters embodying the collective images of Soviet soldiers and officers. Real military units were involved in filming large-scale battle scenes, and authentic military equipment from the war era was used. The film fostered in viewers a sense of personal involvement in great historical events, transforming the collective memory of the war into a crucial element of national identity. A true phenomenon of television culture was Tatiana Lioznova's 12-part film 17 Moments of Spring, released in 1973. The story of Soviet intelligence agent Stirlitz, operating in the highest echelons of Nazi Germany, literally paralyzed the country. Streets emptied during the broadcast of each episode. Vyacheslav Tikhonov created the image of an ideal Soviet man. Intellectual, restrained, devoted to the motherland, yet deeply humane. Stierlitz became a new type of hero, not a warrior but a thinker, defeating the enemy not by force of arms, but by force of intellect. It is noteworthy that the film created a complex, ambiguous image of the enemy. Many Nazi leaders were shown not as caricatured villains, but as real people with their own logic and motivation, which made the victory over them even more significant. A special place in the cinema of the 1970s was occupied by multi-series rural sagas, reflecting Soviet history through the prism of village life. Shadows Disappear at Noon, by Vladimir Krasnopolsky and Valery Uskov, told the story of the Siberian village of Zelyony Dol over several decades, from the Civil War to the post-war period. Through the fates of several generations of villagers, the transformation of patriarchal Russia into a modern socialist society was shown. The film did not hide the tragic pages of history: dekulakization, repressions, the hardships of collectivization, but presented them as inevitable sacrifices on the path to a bright future. Eternal Call, by the same directors, based on the novel by Anatoly Ivanov, became an even more monumental canvas, covering the period from 1906 to 1963. The story of the Savelyev brothers became a metaphor for the fate of the entire country, which went through revolutions, wars, and socialist construction. Particularly strong was the storyline of Yakov Alinikov, who transforms from an illiterate peasant boy into a hero of the Civil War, and then into a manager of a large production. An ideal illustration of the social elevators opened by Soviet power for ordinary people. A key feature of 1970s cinema was the use of music as a tool for emotional impact. Mikhail Taraverdiev's melodies for Quote 5, or Vladimir Vysotsky's songs in The Meeting Place Cannot Be Changed, became cultural codes, instantly evoking a complex of patriotic feelings in the viewer. These musical themes became an integral part of collective memory, linking personal emotions with state ideology. The mobilizational cinema of the 1970s performed an important social function. It created a common semantic field for different generations of Soviet people. Grandparents who survived the war, their children who grew up in the post-war period, and grandchildren who knew about the war only from textbooks could watch these films together, experiencing a sense of national unity and historical continuity. Thus, cinema became a powerful tool for forming collective identity, linking the past, present, and future into a single historical narrative. Perestroika and glasnost burst into Soviet cinema like a fresh wind of change, shattering ideological canons that had been forming for decades. The mid-80s became a time when cinema transformed from a tool of propaganda into a space for critical reflection, rethinking the past and present. Traditional ideological cinema, with its clear moral guidelines and heroic pathos, rapidly lost relevance, giving way to works that posed uncomfortable questions and exposed painful societal problems. Films of this period were no longer weapons of state ideology, but rather scalpels, dissecting the abscesses of the system. A landmark work of this era was Tengiz Abuladzi's, filmed in 1984 but released only in 1987. This surreal parable about the tyrant Varlam Aravidze, whose body mysteriously disappears from his grave after death, became the first open statement about Stalinist terror. The final scene, where an elderly woman asks, quote, "One," became a metaphor for the entire perestroika era, a time of reevaluation of values and the search for lost spiritual landmarks. Alexander Proshkin's film, The Cold Summer of '53, overturned traditional notions of the post-war period. The film told the story of former political prisoners who, after the amnesty of 1953, were forced to defend a remote northern village from a gang of criminals. The film shattered the myth of the unity of Soviet society, showing a deep rift between the victims of repression and those who lived in prosperous ignorance. Valery Priemykov and Anatoly Papanov created poignant images of people who had gone through the hell of the camps but preserved their human dignity. The final scene was particularly powerful, where Papanov's character, having received his long-awaited rehabilitation, realizes that his life can no longer be reclaimed. Vasily Pichel's film Little Vera, released in 1988, became a revolution in cinema. This was the first film to show, without embellishment, the life of working-class youth in a provincial town, with the bleakness of existence, alcoholism, domestic violence, and a lack of prospects. Natasha Negoda created the image of a girl trying to break free from this vicious circle through love for a student from an intellectual family. The film shocked with its frank scenes and naturalistic depiction of Soviet everyday life, shattering the glossy image of developed socialism. An important phenomenon of perestroika cinema was documentary films and newsreels extracted from special archives. Stanislav Govorukhin's Marina Goldovskaya's The Solovetsky Power, The Arkhangelsk Peasant about Fedot Shubin. These films opened previously forbidden pages of history to the viewer, forming a new, critical attitude towards the Soviet past. The re-evaluation even touched upon the military theme, which was considered sacred. Alexei German's Trial on the Road, filmed in the early 70s but shelved as ideologically harmful, finally reached screens. The story of a former prisoner of war who joined the partisans shattered the black-and-white picture of war, showing the moral complexity of choice in extreme conditions. Perestroika cinema became not just a mirror of the processes occurring in society, but also their catalyst. Films of this period formed a new type of civic consciousness, critical, reflective, capable of asking uncomfortable questions to power and society. They transformed the viewer from a passive consumer of ideological directives into an active participant in public dialogue, capable of forming their own position. Thus, cinema, which for decades had served as a tool of ideological mobilization, became a space of freedom and a crucial factor in dismantling totalitarian consciousness. Soviet ideological cinema traveled a long road from revolutionary avant-garde experiments to perestroika's critical re-evaluation. Today, these films are perceived entirely differently than they were during their creation. They have transformed from a tool of propaganda into a historical artifact, allowing us to understand the era and the worldview of the people who lived in it. The 90s were marked by a sharp rejection of the Soviet cinematic heritage. Ideological films were perceived as something outdated, false, and undeserving of attention. Cinemas were flooded with Hollywood blockbusters, while Soviet films seemed archaic and uninteresting to the new generation. Many masterpieces were forgotten, film studios closed, and old-school directors were left without work. However, by the early 2000s, a shift towards re-evaluating the Soviet cinematic experience emerged. Interest grew in the aesthetics of Soviet cinema, its visual language and artistic techniques. Directors of the new wave began to quote classics, reinterpreting their legacy. For instance, Fyodor Bondarchuk, in his adaptation of The Ninth Company, clearly drew upon the aesthetics of Soviet war films, while Karen Shakhnazarov in The Rider Named Death utilized techniques of historical revolutionary cinema. In modern Russia, Soviet ideological films have become an object of nostalgia for the older generation and a subject of cultural study for the youth. Television channels regularly show classics of military cinematography, and 17 Moments of Spring has turned into a source of endless memes and quotes. A curious phenomenon has occurred. The ideological content of these films has receded into the background, while their artistic merits, acting prowess, and directorial ingenuity have come to the fore. Contemporary researchers offer a more complex view of Soviet propaganda cinema. They consider it not only as a tool of state ideology, but also as a space of hidden resistance, where talented directors could express their true thoughts in veiled forms. Thus, in Chapayev, critics today see not only the heroization of a revolutionary commander, but also the tragedy of a spontaneous, popular character that does not fit within the framework of party discipline. It is particularly difficult for contemporary viewers to perceive the images of the enemy in Soviet cinema. Caricatured depictions of Germans, Americans, kulaks, and saboteurs seem naive and primitive today. However, they offer a unique opportunity to understand the mechanisms of forming the image of the other in mass consciousness. Mechanisms that are still at work today, albeit in a more sophisticated form. In the era of information wars and hybrid conflicts, the experience of Soviet ideological cinematography gains new relevance. Modern media uses many techniques developed by Soviet filmmakers: contrasting montage, emotional musical accompaniment, archetypal images of heroes and villains. Studying these techniques helps develop critical thinking and media literacy. Perhaps the main lesson of Soviet ideological cinema lies in understanding the fine line between art and propaganda. The best Soviet films were able to overcome the limitations of ideological demands and become genuine works of art because their creators invested their soul, their understanding of human nature, which transcended official doctrine. This is why we still watch The Cranes Are Flying or Ballad of a Soldier with emotion, even though the ideological context of their creation has long lost its relevance.